I spent the night with a random guy during our anniversary trip, and my husband flew back home, leaving me behind. I've messed up really badly, and it feels like I'm trapped in this chaotic situation. If anyone has faced similar challenges, please lend a hand, as I have no idea how to untangle this mess. I'm a 35-year-old woman, and I've been married to my 37-year-old husband for 3 years. He works in a software company, while I work as an office clerk in a school. We don't have any children. We initially met on Tinder around 5 years ago, started casually dating, and eventually became exclusive when we realized our feelings for each other were genuine. Our relationship was enjoyable, and after 2 years of dating, we decided to tie the knot. Since we were already living together, marriage didn't bring about significant changes. I had hoped that our married life would be smooth sailing, but I couldn't have been more wrong. After 2 years of marriage, we began experiencing problems unlike the typical couple's disagreements. These were serious issues. It all began with minor annoyances, like him leaving his wet towel on the bed or me coming home late from work. Initially, I thought these were normal relationship hiccups that every couple goes through. But the real problem was that we didn't effectively resolve these issues. They piled up and escalated. I vividly recall an incident when my husband didn't return home until well past midnight. I had been waiting for him with dinner and tried calling him, but he didn't answer. I grew increasingly worried. When he finally arrived after midnight, I asked him where he had been. He casually mentioned that a meeting had run late, and he had dinner with his colleagues from the office. I expressed my frustration, mentioning that he could have at least informed me, as I had been waiting for him at home with dinner like a fool. He told me he was sorry, but his demeanor didn't reflect any genuine remorse. Instead, he seemed eager to wrap up the conversation and head to bed. I grew genuinely upset and decided to stop talking to him. We went without communication for an entire week, and I expected him to initiate a conversation and make amends. However, when he did attempt to talk to me after a couple of tries, it felt insincere. He soon ceased his efforts and casually mentioned that he'd be available when I was ready to talk. His lack of effort weighed heavily on me. Despite my reservations, I eventually resumed communication with him, though my discontent still lingered. It seemed like he no longer cared about our marriage. Initially, I suspected he might be involved with someone else secretly, but my investigations yielded no evidence of infidelity. Instead, it appeared that he was losing interest in our marriage. This was hard to accept, considering the same man who used to go to great lengths to be with me. During our dating days, he would pick me up for dinner right after work, but now even a simple phone call seemed like too much of a hassle for him. I grew weary of this lackluster relationship, especially as our intimacy dwindled. One morning during breakfast, I confronted him, stating that if he no longer wanted to be with me, there was no reason for us to continue. I was prepared to remove myself from his life for good. This declaration seemed to finally strike a chord with him. He expressed his love for me, apologized for the pain he had caused, and pledged to rectify the situation. I asked him how he planned to do that, considering our strained communication and growing distance, despite living together under the same roof. He proposed that we needed quality time together and suggested taking a trip for our upcoming 3rd wedding anniversary. He believed it would serve as a way to celebrate the occasion and provide us with a break from our everyday responsibilities. After considering his words, I found merit in his idea. I sensed that the growing differences between us stemmed from our neglect of our relationship. Instead of dedicating quality time to each other, we became preoccupied with various other matters. Romantic conversations between us had become scarce, replaced by discussions about utility bills, groceries, and similar practical concerns. While these topics were important, they should not have taken precedence over our relationship. At the suggestion of my husband, I considered that perhaps some time away from these distractions might be beneficial. I expressed my agreement with the idea of taking a trip, and he enthusiastically encouraged me to choose our destination. He assured me that he would promptly handle all the arrangements. For the first time in months, a genuine smile graced my face, and the one he returned to me was equally heartfelt. It had been a while since he had smiled at me in such a way, and that day, I began to entertain the hope that our situation might not be as dire as I had initially believed. My anticipation for the upcoming trip grew, and I immediately embarked on researching potential destinations. After extensive research, I settled on Bali as our destination. Given that both of us had an affinity for beaches, and Bali boasted some of the most stunning ones, it appeared to be the perfect choice. I eagerly awaited my husband's return from work to discuss the idea. Everything seemed to have taken a 180-degree turn in our relationship. What was once a source of distress had now transformed into excitement. I broached the subject of Bali with my husband, and he shared my enthusiasm, committing to making all the necessary arrangements. After several months of estrangement, intimacy returned to our relationship that night, igniting a sense that our challenging phase might soon come to an end. I began preparing for our trip, which was slated to last a week. We had both taken time off work to fully enjoy our vacation, and when the day arrived, we departed for Bali. The lengthy 22-hour journey left me feeling exhausted upon our arrival. To my surprise, my husband had booked a luxurious suite for us at a high-end resort in New Baud. My excitement soared, and we once again shared intimate moments. However, before long, I noticed his waning interest. Concerned, I asked him what was troubling him and why he was acting distant, but he brushed it off, attributing it to jet lag and the need for rest after our lengthy flight. We decided to take some rest before embarking on our planned exploration of the scheduled attractions. I had meticulously prepared a detailed itinerary to ensure we had a wonderful time during our stay. The following day, we visited Lavina Beach, renowned for its beauty. Our resort had thoughtfully arranged for a taxi throughout our stay. However, my husband began exhibiting the same aloofness he had displayed in recent months. He seemed disinterested, either engrossed in his phone or maintaining a stony silence. My attempts at conversation were met with vague or monosyllabic responses. I speculated that perhaps he needed time to adjust to the new environment, hoping that his indifference might fade over our week-long stay. Upon returning to our resort, he retired to bed, claiming to have a headache. Another day followed in the same fashion. While we explored Bali, my husband continued to exhibit a lack of interest, both in me and in the surroundings. We appeared as two people merely accompanying each other on a vacation. Finally, our anniversary arrived, yet his behavior remained unchanged. Our plan was to explore Ubud, renowned for its arts and crafts in Bali. I had chosen this thinking it would align with my husband's interests. Throughout our time together, he had consistently shown a keen interest in arts and crafts. Whenever he traveled, he would often return with craft items. I had hoped that delving into this artistic world would brighten his mood, but my hopes were dashed. His demeanor remained unchanged. Instead of drawing closer during this trip, we seemed to be growing more distant. I had donned a beautiful paisley dress, specifically chosen for our anniversary. However, my husband barely glanced at me, let alone offered a compliment or initiated a conversation. That day, a whirlwind of emotions washed over me, including hurt, dejection, and frustration. I couldn't comprehend why my husband had brought us to Bali if he had no intention of engaging with me. He had been the one to suggest this trip, and now his distant behavior left me deeply wounded. My emotions spiraled out of control, reaching a breaking point. I had grown weary of his irrational behavior. The moment we returned to our suite, I confronted him, demanding to know what was troubling him. When he began offering the same flimsy excuses he'd been giving throughout the trip, my anger escalated rapidly. I unleashed a tirade, berating him for taking me for granted. His temper flared in response. He argued that nothing he did seemed to satisfy me. Despite arranging our impromptu trip to Bali, I was shouting at him instead of showing appreciation. Our voices rose in a heated exchange. Eventually, he stormed out of the room, expressing a need for space. I didn't try to stop him. Left alone, I lay in bed, attempting to sleep. However, sleep eluded me as the earlier argument replayed in my mind. The more I dwelled on it, the more tears welled up. Sleep became an unattainable goal. Meanwhile, my husband remained absent from the suite. Deciding it was better to leave the large, empty room than stay there alone, I ventured to a nearby bar. Although we had visited the resort's bar a few days prior, I sought a change of scenery that night. I dressed up, refreshed my makeup, and made my way to a bar I had noticed earlier. The establishment exuded a cozy atmosphere, with numerous couples dancing and some engaged in passionate embraces on the dance floor. I settled at the bar and ordered a gin and tonic. The drink helped soothe my frayed nerves, offering a welcome respite from the earlier frustration. I ordered another drink as I tried to take in the ambiance. Seated beside me was a foreigner, a man slightly older than myself. At first, I didn't pay much attention to him, engrossed in scrolling through Instagram on my phone. After quickly finishing my drink, the stranger struck up a conversation with me. He suggested I try a rock shot, a traditional Balinese liquor made from fermented white rice and coconut palm flowers. Intrigued, I decided to give it a try. The shot arrived, and I downed it, finding it quite potent. The alcohol served to relax me, and I began chatting with the stranger. He introduced himself as a solo traveler in Bali, which resonated with my own experience due to my husband's demeanor throughout the trip. As we conversed, I indulged in more rock shots, laughing and engaging with this newfound acquaintance at the bar. At that moment, all thoughts of my husband faded into the background. I can't quite recall the exact details that followed, but I distinctly remember the stranger proposing that we go to his Airbnb together, and something within me led to us sharing a kiss at the bar. I have a hazy recollection of agreeing and going to his villa. Although the details are somewhat blurry, I distinctly remember entering his room and removing my dress. I wish I could erase the memory of sleeping with a stranger on my anniversary trip. I'm fully aware that I messed up by engaging with a stranger during our anniversary getaway. I'm aware I made a terrible mistake, but I can't comprehend what possessed me that night. The following morning, I was abruptly awakened by loud knocks on the door. The combination of the pounding and my hangover made me feel like I was on the verge of death. I hastily put on my dress and opened the door without checking who was on the other side. I was taken aback when I saw my husband standing there, his face flushed with anger. Fear surged through me at the sight of him. He entered the villa and made his way to the bedroom. His anger intensified upon discovering a naked man in the bed. He erupted into a furious tirade, accusing me of infidelity. This commotion roused the man from the bar, who appeared bewildered by the unfolding situation. He inquired about what was happening, but neither my husband nor I responded. My husband's rage escalated and he struck the man on the jaw. The man staggered backward, but my husband continued to pummel him while shouting not to touch his wife. I was petrified but couldn't stand by while this man was beaten for a mistake I had made. I intervened, positioning myself between them and pushing my husband away from the man. My actions only fueled my husband's anger further. I suggested that we leave the scene and return to our resort. Though his eyes were still filled with rage, he reluctantly agreed. We made our way back to the resort, and during the entire journey, my husband regarded me with a seething hatred that I could scarcely bear. Upon arriving at the resort, my husband slammed the cab door with such force that even the cab driver appeared alarmed. I followed him, understanding that his anger was justified, but I couldn't comprehend what had come over me last night. I had never felt so vulnerable before. In our room, I pleaded with my husband to listen to me, but my words fell on deaf ears. He began to toss objects around, shattering everything that had adorned the shelves as decorations. His shouts about how I could do this to him only fueled his growing rage. A call from the resort's front desk interrupted the tumult, as nearby guests grew concerned. This intervention had a calming effect on my husband. He disliked creating scenes. He ceased his shouting and the destruction of property, but his anger still smoldered. He started packing his belongings, and when I questioned his actions, he replied that if he had to look at my face any longer, he might do something drastic to me or the other man. He was leaving and going back. I implored him not to go, but my pleas fell on deaf ears. His hatred for me had consumed him to the point where nothing else mattered. Shortly after, he left me alone, telling me he didn't want to see my face, so I shouldn't bother returning home. I spent the entire day crying, reflecting on and regretting my actions. Any hope of reconciling our relationship had been obliterated by my own actions. It was devastating to realize that I had destroyed our relationship with my own hands. The loathing I saw in my husband's eyes was tearing me apart. After spending the entire day in bed sobbing, I eventually decided to return home. Staying alone at the resort seemed pointless. I called the hotel front desk and arranged for a flight ticket back home as soon as possible. The next day, I arrived at the airport for my flight back home. The hotel staff had questioned my decision, as urgent flight tickets were quite expensive, costing over $2,000, and our room had already been paid for the entire week. Refunds weren't an option, and I affirmed my decision to leave. Staying alone at the resort no longer made sense. The trip had yielded the opposite of my expectations, and I found myself in a mess. The journey back home took over 24 hours, during which I felt anxious and frustrated, leading to bouts of vomiting. By the time I reached the airport, I was mentally and physically exhausted. Despite my desire to return home and reconcile with my husband, I lacked the energy for it. Instead, I chose the easier path and moved in with my parents, who conveniently lived in the same city. Given that my husband had already told me not to come home, and I lacked the strength to plead for his forgiveness at that point, I decided to give him some space. I planned to gather my thoughts and regain my energy before facing him and figuring out how to appease his anger. At my parents' house, I slept through the first 2 days, but my health showed no improvement. Frequent episodes of vomiting and nausea persisted, prompting my mother to suggest seeing a doctor. I agreed and visited our regular doctor, informing her about my fever and vomiting. Her question about my last menstruation took me by surprise, as I hadn't even considered the possibility of being pregnant. My irregular menstrual cycles had led me to dismiss this possibility. After sharing all the details with the doctor, she recommended a pregnancy test, which could be done either at home or in the hospital, with the latter option being more reliable. I opted for the hospital test. As I went through the procedure instructed by the nurse, anxiety flooded my mind. I couldn't recall whether I had used a rubber with the stranger, and I had no means of contacting him. My heart raced as I contemplated the consequences of a positive result. How would I face my husband? I didn't have to wait long for the results. The hospital sent my reports by that evening, revealing that I was pregnant. The shock hit me hard, as it felt like my world was crumbling. Tears welled up in my eyes when I noticed something else in the report. I was 4 weeks pregnant, which meant the child was my husband's. Memories of the night he suggested our trip flooded back, a night I had forgotten. We had become intimate after a long while, and although I was on birth control pills because we didn't want a baby, I must have forgotten to take them. It suddenly made sense why my emotions were so heightened during our trip. It was due to my pregnancy. I hoped that this news might lead to my husband forgiving me now that we were going to become parents. I kept wishing for reconciliation and a chance to move forward from my mistake. I chose not to immediately inform my parents about the pregnancy, believing it was only fair for my husband to be the first to know. That evening, I went to our house with my luggage, but to my surprise, the door wouldn't open with the passcode. I wondered if my husband had changed the locks. Frantically, I called him, but his phone was busy, which was unusual for him. I grew confused and questioned whether he had blocked me, with uncertainty about what to do next. I waited outside our house for an hour, hoping he would either answer my call or return home. When neither happened, I returned to my parents' house. I lacked the energy to explain everything to them, so I made up an excuse, claiming my husband had gone somewhere, and I didn't want to stay alone. I knew they didn't fully buy my explanation, but they chose not to press further and allowed me to be as I wished. So that's the summary of what has transpired in my life over the past few months. I acknowledge it's an unusual situation, but it's my reality, and I'm unsure about my next steps. My husband refuses to communicate with me, and I'm unable to return to my house, all while carrying our unborn child. I'm at a loss for words to soothe his anger. If anyone has any suggestions, please share. Thank you for listening thus far. An update. It has been 4 months since I shared my story. Before I delve into what unfolded afterward, I want to express my gratitude to all the kind people who commented and supported me. Your kindness means the world to me. The morning after my return to my parents' house, I had a scheduled appointment with my gynecologist. Knowing my husband would likely be at the office, as he was the type to go even with a high fever, I decided to meet him first and then proceed to the gynecologist. My hope was that after revealing my pregnancy, he would accompany me to the doctor. When I encountered my husband, his anger had intensified, surpassing his previous state. Although he didn't raise his voice, the intensity of his anger was palpable in his eyes, sending shivers down my spine. Fear gripped me once more. He pulled me aside on his office floor, gripping my arms rather tightly, and demanded to know why I was there. I explained that I had come to meet him. His response was far from welcoming. He expressed his hatred towards me and instructed me to stay away from him. Despite the hurtful words, I mustered the courage to reveal the truth. I told him I was pregnant. What unfolded next still haunts me. He laughed at me, suggesting I should go back to Bali and inform that man. He believed the man from that night was the father of this child. As painful as it was to hear, I knew I had brought this upon myself. I clarified that I was 4 weeks pregnant, emphasizing that he was the father. My words seemed to momentarily stun him, but he quickly regained his composure and uttered even more hurtful words. He declared that he couldn't trust the words of a woman who could sleep with anyone. Tears streamed down my face as I pleaded that I was still his wife, hoping he would believe me. He continued to laugh, unmoved by my tears, and insisted that he had made a mistake marrying a woman of questionable character, vowing to rectify his error. He informed me of his intention to divorce me, despite the fact that I was carrying his child. I repeatedly tried to convey to him the importance of considering the well-being of our unborn child before making any hasty decisions. I pleaded with him to forgive my one mistake and suggested that we could move past it. I emphasized that he shouldn't abandon his own child. His response shattered me. He callously stated that he didn't care and suggested I could choose to abort the child or take any action I pleased, displaying an icy indifference. I was left standing there, feeling frozen in shock. He then instructed me to leave his office premises immediately and never return. Before I departed, he mentioned that his lawyers would soon contact me regarding the divorce proceedings. I left his office in tears and proceeded to see my gynecologist. She conducted my checkup and prescribed some medication. I inquired about the potential effects of the alcohol I had consumed before I was aware of the pregnancy. She reassured me that the baby was in good health and advised me to be cautious moving forward. I didn't broach the topic of abortion with my gynecologist because I was determined to keep the child. At 35 years old, my biological clock was ticking, and my husband's harsh words in the morning would likely change once he calmed down. During the car ride from the gynecologist to my parents' house, I shared the news of my pregnancy with my mother and mentioned the intense argument my husband and I had. I asked if I could stay with them for a few more days. Deep down, I knew I would eventually have to confide in my mother about everything, but a glimmer of hope remained that my husband might come and take me back. I resumed going to work, and I made numerous attempts to call my husband throughout the day, but his phone was always busy. He had blocked my calls for good. As weeks passed, my hope began to wane. Then one day my call actually went through, and he answered. Hearing his voice, I couldn't hold back my tears, and I profusely apologized. I implored him to grant me another chance, assuring him that I would do whatever it took to earn his forgiveness. He listened, and for the first time, it seemed like he was genuinely considering it. He expressed uncertainty about whether he could trust me again. Despite his guarded response, I clung to a glimmer of hope. It marked the first substantial conversation we had had in a long time. I vowed to work tirelessly to regain his trust and forgiveness, but he didn't say much before ending the call. After work that day, instead of going to my parents' house, I decided to visit his place. I rang the doorbell, noticing his car in the parking lot, confirming he was home. When he opened the door, he seemed surprised to see me. I entered and embraced him, and he allowed the hug. Tears streamed down my face, and he comforted me as I repeatedly expressed my remorse and determination to make things right. He attentively listened and then kissed me. I responded to his kiss, and he led me to the bedroom. I followed willingly, and we became intimate that night. I believed that our relationship was on the mend after that night. The following morning, he suggested that I retrieve my belongings from my parents' house and move in with him so that he could take care of both me and our baby. His words stirred my emotions once again, but this time with hope. Everything seemed to be falling back into place. He accompanied me to my parents' house, helped me pack, and we returned home together. He assisted with unpacking, and I felt an immense sense of happiness that had been absent for a long time. He took care of me diligently, showing love and tenderness every night as he led me to bed, and we continued to be intimate. Given that I was only 10 weeks pregnant, it was perfectly safe. About 4 or 5 days after my return home, my husband mentioned that we hadn't had a chance to properly celebrate my pregnancy due to the earlier turmoil. I didn't fully grasp what he meant, so he explained that the circumstances hadn't allowed for a proper celebration. I agreed with him, acknowledging the chaos that had surrounded us. I proposed a simple dinner celebration, but he had grander plans in mind, wanting to mark the occasion in a significant way since it was our first child. He decided to throw a party during the week to announce the pregnancy to friends and family in style, assuring me that everything would be perfect, and I need not worry about any details. True to his word, he took charge of organizing the event, handling the catering and inviting our loved ones. I was genuinely excited about the upcoming party, feeling like we were finally emerging from the dark phase in our relationship. On the day of the party, however, I couldn't shake a growing sense of anxiety, as if something might go wrong. Despite my unease, I prepared for the event, hoping for the best. As the guests began to arrive, I realized that apart from my parents, nobody was aware of my pregnancy. My husband had insisted on announcing it at the party, even though he had informed everyone that we were celebrating our 3rd wedding anniversary. When I heard it, it triggered a painful memory, but I chose to suppress it, believing that things would eventually get better. The party was proceeding smoothly, with everyone laughing and enjoying themselves. My anxiety began to dissipate, and I thought I had been overly worried. I was starting to relax and enjoy the event when everything unraveled. My husband gathered everyone's attention, indicating that he had an announcement to make. I smiled, expecting him to reveal my pregnancy, but his announcement left me breathless once more. He began by mentioning that our actual anniversary had occurred 2 months earlier, and recounted how he had taken me to Bali for that celebration. He proceeded to share details about our anniversary trip, explaining how he had arrived at the resort and found our room empty, leading him on a search to locate me. He described how, with the help of our shared location, he had discovered me in an Airbnb with a stranger. I kept my eyes closed as he disclosed my secret to everyone, realizing there was no point in attempting to stop the revelation. The room fell into a hushed silence as my husband exposed my indiscretion to everyone I knew. Unable to meet anyone's gaze, I tried to flee the room, but my husband prevented me, gripping my hands and guiding me to the center of the living room. He maintained a composed demeanor, stating that he couldn't give me my Bali anniversary trip, so he had chosen to do it today. He handed me an envelope, and I had no doubt about its contents. Following that, I rushed to our bedroom and wept profusely. My husband followed me there, and I implored him to explain his actions. He admitted that he sought revenge for what I had done to him. He revealed that our recent intimate nights together had been part of his scheme to exact vengeance. He wanted everyone to be aware of the kind of person he believed I had become, which is why he orchestrated the entire ordeal. That night, I was utterly heartbroken. I left his house and sought refuge at my parents' home. My mother informed me that my father didn't want to see me. She suggested it would be best for me to spend some time away. I managed to secure a hotel room with the limited savings I had. I lived in that hotel for several days until I was able to secure a small studio apartment for myself. I couldn't face anyone, not even at work, as everyone knew about my mistake in Bali. In different circumstances, I might have considered leaving my job, but I couldn't afford to do so. I had to take care of not only myself, but also the child I would soon be welcoming into the world. My husband hasn't spoken to me since that night. All my communication through him has been through his lawyers. My divorce process with my husband is going on. It's taking some time as there are a few complications about me being pregnant and all. My husband had said that he does not want any parental rights or want to be associated with the baby in any way. There are separate legal issues going on as to how he doesn't want the burden of child allowances, and in return, he'll forsake his parental rights. We haven't spoken to each other after that night. All my communication through him has been through his lawyers. My father had not spoken to me after that day. He had said that because of me, he is shameful and cannot look at me without disgust. I stopped trying to contact him after that, and neither visited their house again. The only person I tried to contact is my husband. I told him that he can divorce me, but to not abandon his child. I told his lawyers that the child is going to need their father, but they said my husband had told them clearly that he doesn't want anything to do with me or the child. The words hurt, but it didn't surprise me. After everything that has happened, this was quite expected of him. I'm currently 5 months pregnant. My bump has started showing. Everyone at work gives me looks, no doubt wondering whose child this is. It seems to everyone that I conceived this child in Bali since my husband is forsaking his parental rights. I don't know how to explain to everyone that this is the child of my husband only. I feel so confused right now and don't know what to do. I just hope that everything gets better, if not for me, then for this child.